Hi, and welcome to this week's lecture on debating in history. I've split this into three sections. In the first, I'm going to say something about the purposes of using debate in the history classroom. In the second, I'm going to say something about the different forms of debate that you should think about using. And in the third, we'll come to some of the practicalities about planning, using, and assessing debate in relation to history learning. So, in relation to the purposes of debates in the classroom, there are some general reasons why a history teacher would be interested in using debate, and I've just listed four basic ones here. So I think it's valuable for a historian to use debate as one of their teaching strategies, because it's a way for us to move away from this simplistic notion of idealised, simple, individual, solitary narratives that give the definitive account of historical events or people, and moves us in subtle ways to an appreciation that there are always multiple perspectives on historical issues. The second reason is that debates give us a format within which we can critically analyse the arguments and evidence in support of one position over another. One of the dangers in promoting multiple perspectives is that we fall into a form of relativism, that anyone can construct any historical story and anyone can believe anything they want, and obviously it's important to keep testing those against the evidence and making sure that they do stand up against the available evidence. What we can do as teachers is reveal the historical thinking that is taking place in children's heads through having formal debates. So we can see and hear the logical, historical and analytical thinking with which children are engaging, and that also means that we can intervene in that, we can assess it, we can make diagnoses about the kinds of interventions that would be helpful in moving them on, and we can have direct conversations with them to try and shift stubborn misconceptions or simplistic interpretations. And then finally, debates give children a relatively fun and engaging and enjoyable way to rehearse their ideas in public, so they can try out ideas, they can try out interpretations, but they can keep adjusting them in the light of other people's arguments, people's counter-arguments, and people revealing better evidence for them to accommodate their opinion to. So those are some of the reasons why a historian might use debate in their classroom, but obviously there are some broader generic skills that we're promoting when we do this, and there are reasons why debate is used more broadly across the curriculum. And here are some of those. So by holding regular debates in the history classroom, we're contributing to these generic skills which will stand children well in all of their subjects. We're encouraging them to organise information. We're encouraging them to be explicit about linking evidence to arguments, and to explain what the connection is between a piece of evidence and an argument. We're encouraging them to communicate clearly, to listen attentively, to respond to others, and to keep their position open. And in this way we're demonstrating a commitment to rigour and open-mindedness and pragmatism in the construction of knowledge. So debates are really useful because they provide us with a kind of role modelling activity where we can demonstrate just how important it is to keep listening to other people's perspectives, because we're always keeping our own point of view under revision and keeping an open mind to accommodate both new evidence but also new, more convincing interpretations of that evidence. So those are some of the general reasons why we might be committed to encouraging debate in the history classroom. I'm going to explore three specific historical reasons, but I'm going to do that to try and make it easier to kind of grasp what I'm talking about. I'm going to do that through one historical example. So I'm going to take as my example the context of teaching about the partition of India. In 1947, India became independent from the British Empire, but in that process it was also divided into two separate political jurisdictions: Pakistan, which was divided into East and West Pakistan, and India. So you can see Pakistan and Bangladesh are now labelled as separate countries because the East and West Pakistan distinction itself became problematic and led to an ongoing civil war, and so there was a further partition. But we're going to be focusing on this 1947 event, the end of empire, the beginning of two new independent states, but at the same time that was accompanied by a kind of fairly violent convulsion in which between 200 and 500,000 people lost their lives, and an estimated 14 million people were displaced, i.e. if they found they were in Pakistan but felt some greater affinity with the Hindu National Congress Party, then they felt that they were duty bound to move to India. Similarly, lots of Muslims moving over into the new Muslim state of Pakistan. So huge disruption to people, families, communities, and huge loss of life, including ultimately Gandhi's own. So this is a fruitful case study with lots of issues that which we might think lend themselves to debate. So the first debate we might have is to encourage historical empathy. So this is the first purpose that I'm forwarding for the use of debate in the history classroom. Now, debate can be used under this heading to enable students to understand different perspectives on an issue or event. For example, assigning students roles in a debate can help them understand why people from different social groups may have had different views on the same person or the same set of events. So this is a way, remember that when we talked about historical empathy in the longer sessions, we're trying to make the distinction between empathy as an emotional response, which is more akin to imagining yourself into someone else's shoes and trying to feel how they would feel, that form of personalised, emotionalised sympathy almost. And what we're after is a more rigorous academic grounding for historical empathy, which is to try to understand people's worldviews and to try to understand the decisions they made in the context in which they made them overall within the worldview with which they used to interpret that context. So this is about understanding people in their context and appreciating their reasons within that broader context, the sense they made of the world, rather than feeling some affinity with the decisions those people made. So you can see here that debate would be useful for practicing that. So if we were going to assign people roles within a debate, then these are the ones we might alight on for a debate about Indian partition. So we might ask people to focus on Gandhi, we might ask other people to focus on the urban and rural members of the Congress Party, Gandhi's party that is. We might ask some people to focus on the Muslim League, and in particular Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who was the leader of the League and de facto therefore the founder of Pakistan when it became an independent state. And we may also pick on Lord Mountbatten as emblematic of the British interest, as he served as the last Viceroy of India. So these people were all very influential in political decisions that led to independence and partition. So in a debate about historical empathy, we'd need to pay careful attention to the kinds of evidence we made available to the students. Remember, this has got to be rationally grounded in an understanding of evidence and context, so we need to make careful selections about the kind of evidence we give to children. We can't give them too much, because then they'll spend too long sorting through information, they'll get bogged down in irrelevant sources of information. So we need to be quite judicious in selecting the appropriate things that shed light on the characters and groups they are representing, that in turn shed light on the broader perspectives we want them to become familiar with in relation to this topic. The second thing we need to do is to provide some form of briefing for each student. We can't assume that they know anything at all about Muhammad Ali Jinnah or the Muslim League or the Congress Party, and it's simply too much to expect younger children to research all of that for themselves. So it's important for the teacher to give enough information for the children to embark on this historical empathetic journey, if you like, with some parameters, with some constraints, and with some basic indicators of the kind of people they were and the kind of issues they were dealing with and the kind of beliefs that they embodied. And then finally, we need to give some thought to the kind of motion we are going to have at the centre of our debate. It can be a motion or a question, but the point is, if we choose the wrong question or the wrong motion to put forward at the beginning, then we can lead children away from historical empathy and towards other kinds of historical questions. So here's an example of what a historical empathy debate question might look like. We might start with the question, why did the Muslim League believe partition was essential? Now, on one level, that's obviously about historical empathy, because it's about trying to account for members of the Muslim League and potentially Jinnah in his own right as the leader of the party. Why did he believe it was essential? So we might just embark on that kind of process. But we also need to recognise, of course, that different interest groups would have formed different opinions about why the Muslim League believed partition was essential. So Gandhi may have felt that Jinnah was being was looking for opportunistic strategies to consolidate his own power base. He may have felt that Jinnah was misinterpreting the intentions of Congress to respect what would become a Muslim minority in a Hindu majority state. So there are different groups who would have different answers to this question. So on the one level, there's a straightforward kind of, what did these people believe and why did they believe it? But on the other level, and the point of assigning roles within the debate is it would encourage this higher, more sophisticated level of understanding. On the other level is this sense that different groups would have had different kinds of answers to a question like that. So this question requires a focus on the evidence and on forming arguments, and the various roles encourage students to be comparative and to understand that there are different views. And it all requires them to draw on contextual knowledge. So there's some really deep and detailed and rigorous historical thinking being employed to debate a question like this. The second reason we might use debate in the history classroom is to encourage children to understand interpretations. So here debates can be useful for encouraging students to think about the strength of evidence and arguments in favour of a particular interpretation. And these debates, I think, would probably be better placed at the end of a unit when students have more evidence and have done more thinking with which to draw together their own position and with which to critique other people's interpretations. So the motion here might be, this House believes that partition and the deaths that resulted were the result of the British government's desire to cut and run. Now, that presents a much starker picture than the first debate, which was about answering a question. This is a motion, and the idea here will be to get people to side either for or against the motion. But there will be different reasons for siding for or against the motion, and having these different roles might help bring out the different perspectives on what those reasons might be. But what this does do is provides a clear interpretation, i.e. that the British desire to cut and run led to partition, which in turn led to these deaths. And that again requires people to draw on specific evidence and specific arguments, and handled well, you could move away from simplistic assertions about right or wrong, guilty or innocent, and move towards a more nuanced position, which is, well, I could see that Gandhi might have some sympathy for the government but may have been intolerant of their desire to get out quickly, but you might also argue that Mountbatten, whilst he didn't really want to cut and run, felt increasingly like the English were losing power to make anything any better anymore, and that ultimately they did need to get out and there was nothing they could really do to influence the line that was being taken by the Muslim League. So there are all sorts of different nuanced positions that children could adopt even in relation to this simple for or against motion. And then the third kind of thing we might do in the history classroom is to use a debate to open up moral questions. Now these, I think, could come earlier in a scheme of work. So there's no need to have covered all of the content initially. So here we might avoid a simple for or against model, and because we're trying to open up a broader range of possible responses to complicated moral questions. And so these debates would be useful for setting the scene for partition, to think about the likely outcomes and then to think about what kind of ethical balancing act were these politicians trying to engage with. So the question I might start with in this debate is, was the scale of human suffering too great to justify partition? This is a general moral question. So we understand about what partition was, we understand what the outcomes were, and then we're just thinking about to what extent could this ever be justifiable as a political strategy, if there was a realistic chance that you could guess that this was going to happen. So this encourages students to focus on the consequences of partition, and it opens up the possibility of thinking about how one might balance political aims and human suffering. And it may also enable students to empathise with the decisions confronting politicians at the time. So by putting something like this at the beginning, when we come to focus on the decisions that Gandhi and Jinnah and the people in the Congress Party were making, then it's helpful for us as historians, as students of history, to have thought through the possible ethical dilemmas that they were dealing with in the abstract, so that we can appreciate what they were doing when we come to look at their concrete speeches and their concrete actions. So in this first part then, I just wanted to establish that, as with all other activities we've talked about in the lectures to date, the purpose of the debate drives absolutely everything. Once you're clear what you want the debate to achieve in terms of students' historical learning, only then can you decide where it goes in your scheme of work. I've suggested an ethical debate might go earlier and an interpretation debate might go later, but they belong in a certain place. There's a logic to where they sit in your sequence of learning. Only then, when it's placed in the sequence of learning and you know what purpose it has, do you know what you need to do to set it up. And only then do you make a decision about what kind of resources are going to be useful. So in part 2, I'm going to say something more about the types of debate you might choose to use. And then in part 3, I'll say something about how you might practically go about planning and using debate in the classroom.